Thank you, everybody, for being here. I know it's been a long couple of days, so hopefully out of this talk, we'll get something interesting for the larger community of AR, VR developers. In this talk, I'll break it up into a couple of areas. One is talk a little bit about some of my earlier work on Bionics, actually, in this particular lab, and how that informed the creation of some general guidelines and framework that I believe translates directly to the development of AR and VR products, specifically in the mobile AR space, with the common objective of ultimately enhancing human performance. We've had great panelists today and yesterday talking about some of the killer applications and some of the ultimately use cases where these kind of technologies will motivate the use of the general consumer space to consume these kind of products or technologies. So before I dive into it, I'll show you a little clip of perhaps some of you will recognize.
We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man. Steve Austin will be that man. Better than he was before. Better, stronger, faster.
Better, stronger, faster. Enabling human augmentation through the use of technologies. Early mentioned in a sci-fi show, 1970s. A lot of you might recognize some of that. This is no longer part of science fiction. Today we see a lot of these areas of technology development becoming a reality in implementations such as artificial limbs, exoskeletons, artificial organs that people nowadays are consuming and are part of their everyday lives. In fact, a lot of that seminal work has been developed just a few floors down at the Mechatronics group headed by Professor Hu He, who I have the honor of becoming his first PhD student, and I was mentored by him. This is not a coincidence. Nowadays, we see that there's this massive technology convergence of all of these areas that have been presented today in one form or the other. IoT, cloud computing, data analytics, AI, fabrication technologies, democratization of the use of social media to empower people, sensor technologies, and a lot of these trends such as quantified self that essentially are motivating people to wear all sorts of technology to improve and better themselves in many different aspects of their life. And it's precisely in these fields of bionics where a lot of these things have been occurring over the past half a century. As I mentioned, this work, a lot of it has been done just a few floors down, and a lot of my work was actually involved in the development of advanced state-of-the-art bionic limbs, which led to a lot of the framework that I'll be presenting shortly. Just to show you a little bit of what that work entails is developing very intimate hardware technology that will become ultimately one with the user, blurring those boundaries between what technology can provide to the user. In the images, you see a amputee working in a very natural way, controlling automatically the use of this kind of prosthesis. And out of this work, we started realizing there were a lot of common themes and a general framework started to emerge, ultimately to provide the end user or the consumer, in the case of those focusing on the consumer products, a seamless experience that balances the functionality of the technology, the interface, as well as the design. And ultimately, when we looked at this value to the end user, we found that there were three huge building blocks that we should take into account while developing this not only human technology interaction, but ultimately what will become human technology integration. And I think a lot of us here started presenting how this augmented reality should become a more an integrated effort rather than just an interface type of tool. The first building block of what we consider is seminal to building these kind of technologies is intention and intelligence. And what I mean by that is the technology or the system should be smart enough to understand what the intent of the user is. And it should be built with sufficient intelligence such that it can understand its context. You can see products like Meta having cameras or Wi-Fi technology to understand location or GPS. So this is a very general understanding of what should become ultimately the way that the system should understand the use case and ultimately who is going to be making use of the technology. The second largest, biggest block that I think it's important to consider in this generalized framework is this notion of communication and interaction. Many of the work that we've been doing as technologists or researchers has always been on a level of triangulation of information. When you have the end user and the technology, as a designer or an engineer, you always become that translator or what needs to happen to the end user. So ultimately, what this system should enable is this frictionless interaction between the technology and the human, such that they can develop a common language. And this is what deals with the level of interaction, right? It should be very frictionless in a way that it becomes seamless to the experience and ultimately the value that it should be delivered. And in the context of communication, you only don't want to have a communication element between the technology and the user, but ultimately within a community. Earlier on, we saw how the talent swarm depended on the use of community in many cases, and frictionless having that communication element was one of the key added value elements to the use of this kind of technology. So once again, a huge building block to enable these technologies to represent and give value to the ultimate application that will depend on what you're interested in. And of course, there's this last notion of enhancing behavior, and in order to deliver long-term value. Today, in the wearable space, we've heard this many, many times, that after the honeymoon period that everybody sort of is accustomed to, you know, the wristbands or the belts or the shoes, after a short period of time, this value or perception of value gets lost. So how do you introduce a continual evolving experience using a standardized piece of hardware such that the more that the user is involved with it, the more value he gets out of it? In the case of the work that I was doing in Bionics, this represented the more that the user was wearing these prostheses, the more it became themselves. It was an extension, a dynamic extension of their body. So when we look at wearables, or AR devices or VR devices, we are looking for the exact same of experience, where the more that the user has an interaction, communication in a smart, intelligent way with this device, the more value it gets out of it. And you can start thinking about tools like machine learning or AI or many others that are currently available to become the norm in all of these elements. But at the end of the day, I think one thing matters the most, is making it personal. Ultimately, that unique experience developed or delivered to that individual is what matters. Is that Joe, the guy who was walking with the prosthesis, or is that Max wearing the AR device? That person, that individual, has to find that unique value to him such that he become more and more important for that product to be used for him. And this is where this other concept of delivering a customizable experience with standardized hardware becomes another key element that I think is super important, especially in the field of AR. Again, all the way through the spectrum from mixed reality, augmented reality, and assisted reality, which we heard a lot of today. And shifting gears a little bit, now bringing all of this framework from Bionics and whatnot, which I developed in this lab for a good amount of time, into the company that I'm working for. You heard yesterday John Fan, CEO of Copen, founder, 35 years developing the core display technologies that went on all of the augmented reality devices that you can see from the 1990s, collaborating with groups at the Media Lab, back from Stanley Petland, defining what the rules of those devices would be, which are basically aligned with the general framework that I just presented. And it's important to mention that is in this exploration throughout the past 3 decades that we've come to sit today, where this is becoming now a reality, especially in the AR and VR space. So the challenge that I was faced with when I joined the company, looking at the heritage, mostly in the military and enterprise world, was precisely how do you bring all of that know-how and all of that core technology into the consumer space, right? It's the big enigma, and how do we do that based on just pure components technologies that have been offered to many other companies that were trying to crack the case. And when we looked and explored different verticals, we took a very specific and careful look at the largest growing wearables market, and that was the health and fitness space, and particularly sports. And that's where I'm entering the second part of my talk, which I ultimately believe this is where the AR and VR space are delivering value, which is enhancing the human performance. And what better place to look at human performance than in athletics? Just a few minutes ago, we heard from Ian that at Nike, that's definitely one of the things that they're looking at, is how do these wearable technologies, AR, VR, can deliver in their consumer space an edge so that they can consume more of the merchandise that they are producing. And when we looked at the application of these core technologies into the sports field about a couple of years ago, maybe 2.5, coincidentally, we struck a relationship with USA Cycling, and in particular the US Olympic Committee, who at the time were exploring different technologies that were state-of-the-art, innovative, to suit up their athletes in preparation to Rio, because they wanted to be able to scratch everything they could, move every single rock, so that they will not be limited by a technology factor that they were not aware of. And it was precisely in this project, which referred to as Project 2016, when many of the most advanced technology development companies came together to outfit their athletes with this kind of technologies. In particular, what we developed was the set of smart glasses, in particular for the track team. The idea here was giving the athlete a new experience in real time with an augmented reality experience such that they can consume and process the data that was necessary for them to adapt quickly and during the moment to the real-time feedback that they were receiving from all the data that was being generated, which was another challenge I'll present earlier. And in fact, I think the next one will be a small video that shows a little bit of what that project entailed. So Solos, which actually is being demoed, I think in one of the tables back here, as I mentioned, is not just a brand and a product that was incubated within Copen and now has bridged the gap into a consumer commercial release. But let me show you this short video that explains a little bit of what the product and the brand is about.
Solos are providing some amazing information to us in a way that is completely different. As an eyewear, the Solos is absolutely revolutionary.
I know a lot of cyclists get really into that gear and into that technology and how to improve, and this is definitely a tool to use to help you improve.
We've been honored to be working with USA Cycling for over a year now, developing this product. We believe that first and foremost, you have to listen to your customer.
There's no other competitor out there that started working with an Olympic team and a national team from the ground up. What do the top level athletes, what are they looking for, what's comfortable, even before we had anything even for the athletes to grab and look at. And I think that, you know, the project just turned out to check all those boxes and even be better than expectations.
You know, the question that they asked was, what do you want in order to win us gold for USA in Rio? So that's always amazing to work with a company like that.
With our team, as we prepare for Rio, the Solos is one of the critical pieces of getting feedback to the riders instantaneously.
The mission of Solos is to really empower the athlete with the critical data that they need to perform at their peak. And this is accomplished through state-of-the-art heads-up display and audio technologies that will enable the athlete to have access in real time to the data that they're actually tracking.
It's cool to have a dual purpose like sunglasses and a power meter all in one.
You can have anything you want on there, your speed, the time, anything.
Well, when you look through it, you'd think it looks really small, but it's actually quite a large display. So it's like this entire upper right quadrant, but if you just like look beyond it, you don't even notice it.
So we had the advantage of being working with them and at the same time developing the core technology that was going to be part of the glasses. So a lot of the cycles of development were shortened, just having to leverage a lot of the internal resources. And we were very fortunate that while working in this project, we believe that we were a strong contributor on giving this amazing athlete group the World Championship for the first time in London after probably about 6 months of working with them, developing the technology, and at Rio, the silver medal, when the average group that participated was 19 years old. So it's a very young team, first experience in the Olympics, and being able to get that second place was a huge success for USA. And for us, of course, having the building blocks to demonstrate how these kind of technologies could provide the athletes that performance enhancement tool that they will need to ultimately added value to their training. So just to recap what Solos is, it's a pair of smart glasses that is actually leveraging a lot of the computational power of smartphones and smartwatches, acting as the hub of all the sensor data that gets aggregated from the user: power meter, heart rate, lactic acid threshold, muscle activation. All of that information is processed in real time through the cloud or internally through the mobile phone, and ultimately delivering the information that the athlete needs at the moment. So for one of the athletes, it might be their power data. For another athlete, it might be their cadence, or simply the motivational aspect that Ian was mentioning before, right? When they're actually getting to that bunk element and they need that extra element of motivation, they can have that element through the glasses being delivered in a smart, undistractive or non-obtrusive way. This is just the kind of content that they can have. Ultimately, it's customizable, talking about the individual and the personal experience. The athlete can customize what information and insights they need in order for them to improve that level of performance. So they can motivate, for example, if that's what they're interested in, or they can control over that through the pre-programmation of the smart technologies that it's been built into the overall system. In this process, we had to deploy the software in multiple platforms from iOS to Android, such that we can have a better understanding of, if we wanted to release these commercially, what will be the building blocks, as well as the limitation and challenges to deploy commercially. In an initial stage, we were able to deploy this through a very limited production over the course of 2017, where we received all of the feedback from beta users. That brings us to the new commercial launch we just happened last week. In this process of developing this technology with USA Cycling, we cannot avoid the problem of data and crunching the numbers. So as part of the overall framework, we relied on all of the expertise of guys like IBM, which we brought their horsepower, especially with their Watson cognitive analytics, to deliver a customized platform that will inform the smart glasses of what each one of the individual athletes had to do, as well as giving the information to the coach of what exactly is that each athlete was doing at any given moment of time, just to give you a sense of what would happen if they didn't have this tool. Each one of the athletes will go about doing their training. The coach will try to yell at them how they're doing, and at the end of each training session, one of the coaches, Neil Henderson, which you saw in the video, will download the data from each one of the riders' bike computers, go to the hotel room, download it to the app, plot it in an Excel sheet, try to analyze, make sense based on his framework. And it was not until the following day where he will share that information with the coach, and probably halfway through the second training session, they will say, hey, I think you were trying to do this yesterday, like halfway through your training. So with these kind of technologies, that process became in the order of seconds. So the athlete can actually see it and share that feedback in real time. And this is the kind of user experiences that the athlete was seeing. Given that they were going at this speed, they were focused on very short, snappable, consumable pieces of information that will allow them to react while doing the activity. We were very fortunate to have good traction with the media, especially after the launch last week, where we announced that we were not just focusing on cycling and the elite, but actually expanding the use case to runners that happen to be using the technology as well in our first release for a lot of the training. So we were very excited to collect all of that information and be able to support the notion of how this technology is expanding, not just in a technology push from the company, but actually as a demand from the athlete or the consuming element itself. So this is a short video that shares some of that new evolution of the target market. smart communication, ultimate performance, delivering what the emoji of the Olympics, right? Being faster, stronger, which when we heard at the beginning of the video, ultimately was the purpose of bringing technology to the humans in the first place. And just to refer back to the overall, the Bionic framework, what this kind of technology is trying to do today is precisely closing the loop and the gap between the data, the information, and the knowledge that the athlete needs to perform exactly at the time when they need it. So having that said, I'll conclude my presentation. So thank you very much for standing by. If you have questions, thank you.